I observe in these critical years a fundamental transformation of the international order that goes far beyond traditional military confrontation and inaugurates a new era of geopolitical warfare. Ray Dalio's recent warning about a world in which global capital is divided into blocs marks not merely an economic forecast, but the recognition of a revolution in the power system that is already underway. What we are witnessing is the birth of capital wars, a form of confrontation in which currencies become weapons, investments become instruments of control, and financial systems turn into battlefields. This transformation surpasses any conventional war in its strategic implications, as it systematically reconfigures the foundations of state sovereignty and economic autonomy. The speed of this development is breathtaking. While military conflicts require decades of preparation, capital wars can be decided within hours. A single algorithm can destabilize national currencies, a sanctions announcement can wipe out trillions of dollars, and a swift cutoff can sever entire economies from the global market. This new form of warfare operates at the speed of light, and with the brutality of total economic destruction. The current phase differs qualitatively from all previous forms of economic warfare. Whereas trade wars traditionally relied on tariffs and quotas, capital wars operate through the control of capital flows, the manipulation of currency reserves, and the strategic weaponization of financial systems. The American dollar system, the foundation of the global economic order since Bretton Woods in 1944, is systematically employed as an instrument of power. While alternative financial architectures simultaneously emerge to challenge this dominance, this development is rooted in the structural overexpansion of the American financial system since the 1970s. The end of gold-dollar convertibility in 1971 established a system in which the United States could print unlimited dollars, while the rest of the world was required to accept this currency for international trade. This exorbitant privilege enabled America to finance its military expenditures, social costs, and consumption excesses through the de facto taxation of the global economy. Yet this dominance rested on a fragile equilibrium. The United States had to run permanent trade deficits in order to supply the world with sufficient dollars for international trade, a structural contradiction known as the Triffin dilemma. At the same time, continuous dollar creation rendered the system vulnerable to crises of confidence and inflation. China recognized this structural dependency as early as the 1990s and began systematically developing alternative financial infrastructures. The Belt and Road Initiative is less an infrastructure project than a geopolitical instrument aimed at creating yuan-based trade circuits. Beijing's reduced holdings of U.S. treasuries from $1.3 trillion in 2013 to under $800 billion in 2024 document a calculated strategy of reducing dependence on the dollar. In parallel, China invested heavily in technologies that enable financial autonomy, blockchain systems, digital currencies, and alternative payment infrastructures. The cross-border interbank payment system, CIPACE, already processes over 80% of all yuan-denominated international transactions and offers a functional alternative to SWIFT. The war in Ukraine served as a catalyst for this transformation. Russia's exclusion from SWIFT and the confiscation of $300 billion in Russian reserves demonstrated to all nations the existential danger of dollar-based financial integration. These measures were not merely sanctions but a message. Any country that defies American interests can be cut off from the global financial architecture within hours. The reaction was systematic and global. Within 18 months after the war in Ukraine, 40 countries reduced their dollar reserves, 23 nations signed bilateral currency swap agreements, and 15 central banks began developing their own digital currencies. What was intended as punishment for Russia became a wake-up call for the entire non-Western world. The United States acts as a financial hegemon seeking to compensate for its declining relative economic power through the aggressive instrumentalization of the dollar system. Washington has perfected a system in which American banks function as enforcement arms of U.S. foreign policy, while the dollar as the global reserve currency denies every other state effective sovereignty. The American strategy of financial warfare operates on three levels: first, through primary sanctions against target nations; second, through secondary sanctions against companies that trade with those countries; and third, through control over international payment systems such as SWIFT. This architecture transforms the entire global financial system into an American instrument of control. However, this strategy is already showing signs of fatigue. The US Treasury now administers sanctions against more than 9,000 individuals and 6,000 companies, an overextension that reduces effectiveness and causes compliance costs to rise exponentially. American banks are beginning to withdraw from international markets to avoid sanctions risks, a trend that ironically weakens dollar hegemony. China positions itself as a systemic challenger that not only confronts American hegemony but creates alternative institutions. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank (AIIB), the Cross-Border Interbank Payment System (CIPs), and the BRICS New Development Bank are not merely financial institutions, but cornerstones of a post-American economic order. Beijing's strategy is based on the patient construction of parallel structures. While the United States increasingly deploys its financial weapons and in doing so undermines their long-term credibility, China systematically builds institutions that offer nations an alternative to the dollar system. This strategy is time-consuming but sustainable, as it relies on attraction rather than coercion. China's digital yuan (TCEP) is the crown jewel of this strategy. With over 260 million registered users and an annual transaction volume exceeding $100 billion, it demonstrates the viability of sovereign digital currencies. In parallel, China is developing quantum-encrypted communication networks for financial transactions that evade Western surveillance. The BRICS states, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, have evolved from a discussion-based forum into a practical alternative to the Western-dominated financial system. The expansion to include Saudi Arabia, Iran, Ethiopia, Egypt, and the UAE signals the transformation into a serious geopolitical bloc representing 45% of the world's population and 35% of global economic output. This expansion is less ideologically driven than pragmatically motivated. Member states primarily seek protection from American financial weaponization and the ability to conduct bilateral trade in their own currencies. The BRICS New Development Bank already possesses $100 billion in equity capital and has issued $30 billion in loans denominated in local currencies. Particularly significant is the Saudi shift. Riyadh is experimenting with yuan-denominated oil sales to China and discussing integration into China's digital currency system. This could mark the end of the petrodollar system, which has been a pillar of American financial dominance since 1973. Europe finds itself in a strategically precarious position as a captive junior partner. The ECB remains de facto subordinate to the Federal Reserve, while European banks are unconditionally subject to American sanctions regimes. The euro was conceived as an alternative to the dollar, yet European financial integration with the United States makes genuine monetary independence impossible. At the same time, Brussels recognizes the strategic risks of this dependency. The digital euro is explicitly being developed as an instrument of strategic autonomy, while the EU has created its own payment systems for trade with Iran. These half-hearted attempts at autonomy reveal both European ambitions and their structural limitations. I recognize in current developments a self-reinforcing escalation spiral in which every American sanctions measure strengthens incentives for alternative systems. The confiscation of Russian reserves was a turning point that made it clear that dollar reserves no longer serve as a safe store of value but as potential hostages of American foreign policy. The reaction was predictable: massive reallocation of dollar reserves into gold, other currencies, and alternative assets. Central banks worldwide purchased over 1,000 tons of gold in 2023, the highest level since 1967. This de-dollarization is not anti-American ideology, but rational risk diversification. At the same time, the technological dimension of capital wars is intensifying. China's digital yuan (DCEP) is not merely a monetary innovation but a geopolitical instrument for circumventing American financial control. The United States is responding by developing its own central bank digital currency (CBDC), leading to an arms race for digital monetary hegemony. Blockchain technology fundamentally transforms the possibilities for financial sovereignty. Decentralized payment systems can bypass American control over traditional banking networks, while smart contracts enable bilateral trade without dollar intermediation. These technological developments democratize financial autonomy and systematically reduce American control capabilities. I project three plausible development paths, each with fundamental implications for the global power order. In the first scenario, continued American financial weaponization accelerates de-dollarization and leads to the emergence of multiple regional financial blocs. A China-dominated Asian bloc competes with a European Euro bloc and an American-controlled Atlantic bloc. Trade between blocs is minimal, capital flows are tightly controlled, and global economic integration fragments into regional autarkic systems. In the second scenario, a two-bloc system emerges, consisting of an American-European democracy bloc and a Chinese-Russian sovereignty bloc, while the majority of developing countries navigate between the two systems. Digital currencies become primary instruments of bloc competition, while traditional international institutions such as the IMF and World Bank lose relevance. In the third scenario, the overextension of American sanctions capacity leads to a systemic collapse of the dollar system. A global financial crisis triggered by massive capital flight from the dollar zone forces a redesign of the international monetary architecture. A new Bretton Woods system establishes a multipolar reserve currency regime based on gold, SDRs, and regional currencies. The transformation toward capital-based conflicts fundamentally reconfigures international power relations. Traditional concepts such as containment, balance of power, and military deterrence lose relevance, while financial warfare, economic statecraft, and monetary sovereignty become central strategic categories. Small and medium-sized powers paradoxically gain autonomy through this development. While military parity with superpowers is impossible, nations can achieve significant strategic independence through intelligent financial policy. Switzerland, Singapore, and Dubai demonstrate how financial innovation and neutrality can generate disproportionate geopolitical influence. Europe finds itself in a particularly precarious position. The euro was designed as an alternative to the dollar, yet European financial integration with the United States makes genuine monetary independence difficult. The ECB remains de facto subordinate to the Fed, while European banks are subject to American sanctions regimes. What I recognize in this transformation is not merely a cyclical shift in the international system, but the structural end of the monetary Pax Americana. The dollar system, which guaranteed global stability for 8 decades, is becoming an instrument of instability as it is increasingly instrumentalized for geopolitical objectives. The irony is that American financial weaponization creates precisely the alternatives it sought to prevent. Every sanctions measure motivates further countries to develop dollar-independent systems, while every reserve confiscation undermines trust in American financial institutions. We are at the beginning of an era in which financial autonomy becomes the foundation of national sovereignty. Countries that remain fully integrated into the American financial system effectively accept the role of American protectorates. Those that develop alternative systems risk American hostility but gain strategic independence. The coming decade will determine whether this transition occurs peacefully through the development of parallel systems or catastrophically through the collapse of the existing system. What is certain is this: the era of unconditional dollar hegemony is over. What follows is a multipolar financial world in which capital wars replace traditional diplomacy and economic sovereignty becomes the ultimate source of political power. The future belongs to those nations that are the first to recognize this. In the New World Order, sovereignty belongs to those who control their own currency, their payment systems, and their reserves. All others are merely tributaries of foreign financial powers.